Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the panel on economists, economics, and indigenous people. My name is Dominic or Nick Parker, and I'll be the chair. I'm an economist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm happy to chair this session and honored to do so, but I'm really a figurehead. Ross Emmett is the mastermind and the organizer of this session. I am not an economic historian, nor am I a scholar of the history of economic thought, but I do study the economics and the economies of indigenous communities and how colonial policies have affected their development. So I do have an interest in this topic. So the common theme across the papers is that all seek to unpack how economists have viewed indigenous institutions and indigenous well-being over the years, and also to ask if those views were accurate and if they were appropriate. So we have four excellent scholars making presentations today. And the first is going to be Donna Fair, who is presenting a co-authored paper. Each presenter has 20 minutes and followed by as much time as we have for Q&A, but we'll try to leave about 8 minutes for Q&A. So you can ask your questions in written form, and then I will read them at the end of each presentation to the presenter, and the presenter can then answer the question. So with that, we'll give the floor to Donna Fair.
Thank you so much, Nick. So first of all, and also thank you to everyone and to Ross for organizing this session. I'm joining you all today from Lekwungen Territory, what is now known as Victoria, Canada, and BC. Now, I'm going to be talking today about work that is joint with the really inspiring and incredible and Carlos and Angela Reich. And our paper here is titled Indigenous Nations and the Development of the US Economy, Land, Resources, and Dispossession. Now, we were motivated to do this work because it was clear to us, as it is to many others, that US economic development involved a substantial reallocation of land and resources from indigenous nations to settlers. And yet this critical feature or fact of the history of US economic development seems largely absent from the economic history literature. Now, we actually argue that understanding this fact is actually important to understanding the mechanics of the growth of the American economy. So it's important because it changes potentially our understanding, particularly economists' understanding of the role of institutions and property rights in US economic growth, certain features of US economic development, such as homesteading, the railroads, and banking panics even. We also believe it's crucial for understanding the economic outcomes of indigenous nations today. Now, what we believe we demonstrate in this paper is that the experiences of indigenous nations, when they're included in economist stories of US history, the sweeping narrative of the United States as a leader in the security of property rights and the rule of law, and hence its economic success, at least must be questioned and potentially amended, when we would argue amended. Specifically in this paper, what we do is we provide a framework for understanding the chronology of US history and teaching US history by describing how the land came to be owned by European settlers and their descendants, at least by US law, in a large measure by undermining the relationships of indigenous people to their lands. And specifically, we focus on the time before 1871. Now, I want to emphasize here that we are not totally reinventing the wheel. There's obviously a substantial literature on this by historians and indigenous studies scholars, and their work really allows us to do some of the work that we do here. We should also acknowledge that there are a few pieces of substantive work by economists in this time period that take into account the importance of indigenous nations in US growth and policy. Such as Doug Allen, the ongoing work by Brian Leonard, Laura Dabanoff-Taylor, Mac Gregg, and others. Okay. Now, our key objective in writing this paper is to support those who wish to teach a more expansive view of US economic history and spur work on indigenous inclusion in in the core narratives of US economic growth. Now, the paper today, well, this presentation is going to follow the paper very closely. So we're going to start by framing some important concepts and ideas for our discussion and providing a timeline of dispossession and correcting some common misunderstandings. Then we're going to relate the evolution of the bargaining power between treaty parties and provide some evidence on the impact of this changing bargaining power. And we'll conclude by coming back and wrapping up with some statements about what our discussion means for thinking about US economic development and moving forward. Now, at the beginning of the paper, we think it was important to discuss three kind of big concepts, at least three big concepts, in order for any of us to have a reasonable discussion of US Indigenous interactions and economists' telling of US economic development. Okay. Now, we first want to be very clear what economists typically mean when they talk about property rights. Often they're following Blackstone and Dennett, where they define property ownership or complete property rights as the right to use, alter, exclude, transfer an asset to others, including land. Now, of course, these rights are allocated differently across societies and across time. But what we think is crucial to understand here and emphasize when we tell a history of US economic development that includes Indigenous nations is that property and the changing nature of land holdings in the US was more than just about property ownership. Okay? It was in fact about sovereign jurisdiction. Now, sovereignty, and this is important for I think will become clear in a moment, but sovereignty we define as the ability to specify and enforce laws that govern specific geographical spaces, including regulating who and what might cross borders. Sovereignty also allows a collective to self-determine social rules and rules generally related to social operations, including those rules related to property. Now, this is important because while individual transactions over land as property may have implications for sovereignty, also a substantial acreage of land transactions in North America during colonization were not private property transactions between individual settlers and Indigenous people. They were transactions between sovereigns. Okay? These transactions were motivated often by the desire of colonial parties to bring land into private colonial possession. But transfers of sovereignty did more than just convey land or rights to land, but also the authority to specify rights and to enforce these rules of the game that economists take to be important for growth and economic well-being and inclusion. Now, the sovereign transactions we're going to discuss are often in the form of treaties, and we're going to focus on treaties and what we're just going to talk about in the paper and today. But now, sovereign transactions over one person's transaction over their jurisdiction, we also must recognize impacts the ability of other nations to protect their own spaces and may affect their incentives to engage in treaty-making processes. And the paper, we call the sovereignty externalities, and I'd be happy to talk about that more in the future if you'd be interested. Now, finally, this last concept is good institutions. Now, economists call the rules of the game that are inclusive to economic growth often as good institutions, specifically with regards to property. So following ASSA, Johnson and Robinson, Lamoureux, Silveroff, and Engelman, good institutions are characterized by the security of property rights, constraints on expropriation, equal access to resources across a broad section of society. Now, what about when we're talking about transactions and negotiations between sovereigns? Okay, now we extend this idea of good institutions to the notion of treaty making. So the sovereign to sovereign transactions over land and jurisdiction over that land. Now, in this context, good institutions would be treaties that would be negotiated and enforced to maintain a level playing field and provide a foundation for future investment. In addition, in a world of good institutions, once a treaty was signed, further changes to that treaty because of a change in the other party's bargaining power position should not lead to a forced renegotiation of the contract or treaty. Okay? If we think about these things as somewhat parallel. Now let's keep these in mind as we recount the history of US development and US Indigenous treaty making, and kind of keep this concept of mind of good institutions, sovereignty, and property and ownership. So let's start though, where many economic history textbooks begin. Okay, so American economic history texts often show the territorial expansion of the United States, or the US Republic, as demarcated by the acquisitions depicted in this figure. So the Louisiana Purchase, the Florida Acquisition, Texas annexation, Oregon country, and the Mexican Acquisition, etc. In addition, the most recent historical statistics of the United States give the acreage in the public domain of the US as the land area in these inter-European transfers. Now, arguably, however, what was actually being acquired by the United States was not the actual land nor jurisdiction over this land, but rather a right to treat with the sovereign indigenous nations whose land lay within these boundaries. Okay? So when English settlers actually arrived to Jamestown in the 1600s, the philosophy of Europeans believing that the right to discovery gave them the title to the land at that time was actually waning in European legal and popular thinking. Okay? And while there was a period over uncertainty about who was actually supposed to transact over land, was it private individuals, by 1763, the British Crown made it clear that, at least in the areas that they had the right to treat with indigenous nations, only land could come under the Crown's jurisdiction with negotiation with indigenous nations. Okay. Now, of course, when the US broke from the British, there was a short period of expropriation of land from indigenous nations. But the US, with the Non-Intercourse Act of 1790, declared also something similar to that of the British Crown. No purchase, grant, lease, or other conveyance of land, or any title or claim to any land from any indigenous nation or tribe of Indians shall not be valid unless it is made and duly executed by some public treaty under the authority of the United States. Okay. Now, of course, neither the Royal Proclamation nor the Non-Intercourse Act actually stopped people from trying to buy land from individual settlers, but that land would not actually have legal title and could not be registered or used as collateral within US law, given this framework. So thus, the new republic recognized indigenous nations and sovereign and had to negotiate with them in order to actually bring this land into their jurisdiction. Okay. So this is the host of nations. And again, this is a depiction as of 1600, this is from a Western depiction of geographies here. But basically this indicates to you, this is the actual set of parties that the US had to negotiate and other Canada had to negotiate with if they were to legally acquire title at this time period. Okay. So we suggest that US history textbooks should start by something sort of like this, and then first start by dispelling what's known as the Preceded Myth, which I'm not going to talk a ton about today, but it's essentially the land was uncultivated, unused, or uninhabited. What we should do in economic history textbooks, that we argue, is talk about the economic structures that existed prior to contact, the vast system of trading networks, and the cultivation of the land. Then they might consider moving to a more accurate visualization of the land brought into US public domain in US law through the treaty process, as depicted in a subset of the figures that we have in the paper. Now, of course, a lot more complexity underlies this process. Okay. So most treaties specified within these broad regions were used to resolve disputes, but we actually had to define these boundaries, and defining these boundaries was actually a pretty major exercise in and of itself. Okay. Now, I should also mention that in the early 1800s, again, the idea that these were legally binding contracts, in the early 1800s, the US actually, the federal government, was willing to evict squatters from clearly indigenous territories and passed a federal law in 1807 to do so. However, after that period, the legal environment started to shift in ways that increased settler encroachment. Okay. So here are a series of US legal decisions, particularly the Marshall Court decisions, and the last three are much better known. But this first one, Fletcher versus Peck, was arguably really important for actually the evolution of US law with respect to indigenous rights over land and their jurisdiction over that land. So in Fletcher versus Peck, the court recognized Georgia's right, so Georgia, the state of Georgia, to sell a future right to land that had actually not yet been ceded by treaty. And this gave a big change to the legal landscape. So basically, people could speculate over land that was actually not yet ceded. Okay, and people could grant rights to sell that land in the future should it become ceded. Okay, so this led to a lot of land speculation and attempts to claim land. The following three court decisions, again, there's a little bit of, they simultaneously eroded and somewhat protected Indigenous sovereignty, but if you take it from the position of the starting point, they were substantial erosions and eventually reduced Indigenous title to occupation at the discretion of the US government. Okay. Now, these decisions eventually led to arguably the expropriation of Cherokee Nation's territory in Georgia and the forced relocation of many nations from the southeast of the United States. I also want to respect others' time, so I think I should move forward. But essentially what these court decisions did is increase incentives for settlers to speculate on land. Homestead Acts started to be passed. And what this did is increased settler pressure onto Indigenous territories and boundaries. And what we try to show here is a depiction of the fact that increasing population density in your neighbor's territory, so let's say a neighboring nation signs a treaty with the US government, or even if they don't, if people are flooding to that area, the likelihood that you will sign a treaty, regardless of how many settler folks are in your territory, actually increases. So these pressures on the boundary from settlers from either land speculation or homesteading increase the probability that Indigenous nations actually ceded their land, okay, as part of these negotiations. And this is a point that Doug Allen makes in some of his work that I'm happy to point people to. So in this period too, where sovereignty of Indigenous nations over their lands was eroded by US law, we also see the transfer of land before, again, that it's ceded. Here we're depicting the route of the Union Pacific Railroad. It's frequently noted that the Union Pacific Act and the Homestead Acts were passed in 1872 only by a compromise. But what's not mentioned, that's a compromise politically within the US, but what's not mentioned is that they did not compromise with the Indigenous nations. While the US still said in the Union Pacific Act that they would have to extinguish the title as rapidly as possible of Indigenous nations across this territory, whether that was done in all spaces is clearly not obvious. So you can see that the railway route passed through lands that probably was on the border of being counted as ceded or not, and through territory that was not yet ceded by treaty. Okay. Now, of course, one must ask, given that in a period of just a few years, the US claimed to actually extinguish Indigenous title in this large period, given this rapid pace, to what extent was these actions free and informed agreements, and to what extent was force involved? Now, of course, with all contracts, they're on the spectrum of free and willing to coercion. Okay. Now, one thing we think should slice on this is that as the boundaries of the US expanded inward, and what we're showing here is the largest and most recognized Indian wars of the time period. The lightest is the earliest and the darkest is later. So we can see in here during the expansion of the railroad, there was increases in violence. And at any point that US boundaries shifted, you also see some violent conflict emerging. Okay, so you might take this as evidence that this process is not just simply people sitting down at the table and negotiating. It's also a physical threat by the presence of actual people that can carry out violence and also the resultant violence. Okay. All right, so okay, 4 to 5 minutes left. Great, that's perfect. Thank you. So in addition, as the capacity of the US to enact violence on Indigenous nations with increasing settler populations, decreasing status within American law, incentivized in part because of the decision that people could speculate on land without title necessarily being ceded as a future potential cession. Indigenous nations arguably experienced a decline in their position and their ability to negotiate treaties or contracts that were beneficial to themselves. So what we're depicting in this figure is an index by Arthur Sperling, who's a political scientist. Again, happy to point you to the paper where he generates this index. Is a principal components analysis of treaty harshness. Right? And this is the primary principal component. And what is depicted here is a declining set of terms for an indigenous nation over this period while the US was expanding. Okay, this early set of legal decisions you can see here results in a cluster of treaties being signed and a decrease in the relative terms of those treaties. We also want to note right here is these orange dots or these X's here, and these little crosses are treaties that you could consider either unratified or rejected treaties. Sometimes a subset of these are explicitly considered broken treaties or treaties that were explicitly hidden, and those increase over time in number. Okay. Now, an example, say, of these broken treaties, to be specific, is one set of treaties. There were 18 treaties signed in 1851 with more than 100 California, or what is now California, nations who ceded approximately 66.5 million acres to retain about 8.5 million acres in exchange for retained rights and resources in those regions. However, at this time, California held the balance of power in the Senate, and as a result, these treaties were not ratified, and in fact, they were hidden away from public view, and they were only rediscovered years later after the nations in California lost their land without compensation. So this also hints at some of the complexities in those early treaty figures I showed you, where you see the land cession of California. Well, those lands, while considered ceded, were actually treaty obligations were never delivered upon, even though there was these agreements in place. Now, the rejection of treaties that indigenous nations had thought were binding and the recontracting of already signed treaties were not atypical. So what I'm showing you here is actually a figure where we take US counties and the number of times a particular area in a county has been ceded by a treaty, right? So what we can see here by the red is these are areas where you have an area treated on at least 5 times. So you could think about a recontracting of overland over 5 times after that nation's bargaining power has diminished with increasing power of settlers. So we have this renegotiation of these contracts. Now, these examples merely hint at the complexity of US land acquisition as a process, but what I hope I've made it clear is that US economic development was based on a substantial reallocation of land and resources from indigenous nations to settlers, and that those mechanisms of reallocation is essential to understanding US economic growth, in particular in the context of thinking about good institutions in that growth. Recall, good institutions, as defined by economists, provide security of property rights and relatively equal access to economic resources, and put constraints on the powers of actions of elites, politicians, and other powerful groups, so they cannot expropriate the incomes and investments of others. Now, arguably, good institutions did not characterize the process I've just described. Okay. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves us as economists with a lot of work to do. Well, surely there are many contributions we haven't considered. A few projects come to mind that I've listed here, and I'm happy to just leave them up if people have questions about them. But what we hope comes from this paper is that American economic history must incorporate the process of territorial acquisition rather than just starting from a narrative of abundant empty land that was acquired by other inter-European negotiations. Okay. Such a narrative is inaccurate and incomplete and provides a flawed basis on which to draw conclusions about the quality of institutions and the role of those institutions in American economic growth. It also erases many peoples and their histories and undermines a true accounting of the costs of the development and expansion of the United States. And what we hope this paper does is lead to more inclusive models of US economic growth and an understanding of indigenous economic positions today. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Donna. This sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading the paper. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for questions and answers. You can put a question in the Q&A. You can write a question down in the Q&A option in your Zoom. I guess I'll ask a question. I don't see any questions yet in text, so I'll ask one. It seems to me that one of the challenges of making treaties in this framework is, who has the authority to treat, especially on behalf of indigenous groups. And you mentioned the 1851 treaties, the ones in California. Some of the groups had quite decentralized authority. Have you looked into that, this process of territorial acquisition and the legitimacy of who was treated with, and any strategic interactions there? And is this also exploitation in terms of treating with people who didn't have the authority to make agreements on behalf of people that they lived among? Was that exploited, and does that also call into question the legitimacy of some of these contracts?
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. So I think there's several things I want to say in response, and apologies that I didn't leave as much time as I was hoping to for questions. But I think the first piece is I want to acknowledge the work by Terry Anderson on the work he's done on treaty making and when we expect violence to occur versus a treaty. So I would point people to that work as just kind of a first piece that I'd mentioned earlier. But also, yes, I think is the short answer. First part is the Royal Proclamation of 1763 actually set out the mechanisms to try to avoid this very problem, because early transactions between settlers or others was, okay, well, do you have the actual right to transfer this land, right? So before the actual Royal Proclamation, so that set out a process where there had to be a community, a public forum in which these things were negotiated and agreed upon. So that was meant to help try and actually address and solve part of these problems. In addition, many treaties that were signed, that again, I was depicting as ceded, were questionable, right? So for example, the Treaty of Nuanoka, which was signed by a splinter group of the Cherokees, was used as justification for Cherokee relocation. And the validity of a splinter group signed on behalf of everyone, I suppose, is a very open question. I know these things are complex, and this is not the only example. So you're right that in terms of thinking about who has the actual authority to sign these treaties, finding those people or exploiting potential divisions within a community leads to, again, some complexity around these contracts and how we should understand these land transfers.
Thanks. I'm sure it's a question with a really long answer, so kudos for being concise in a response. So let's go with one question is, where can Dick Todd wants to know where he can find the current version of the paper, and we can respond to that offline. But we'll go with one more question, which is from Annie Cott. Were there theoretical or ideological discussions among economists, legal scholars, or other social scientists about these dispossessions?
So Annie, thank you for the great question. So there is an immense amount of literature. Well, I guess it depends on your definition of events, but there is a substantive literature, I think, between legal historians, legal scholars, and other social scientists and Indigenous studies scholars. I don't think there hasn't been much interaction with for economists in these conversations. I mean, really what we're trying to do with this paper is trying to start to bring some economists into these conversations and start thinking about these issues. I'm sure some people will read our work and who are like experts in either their legal field or another field and could critique what we write, and then we certainly welcome those critiques. And we do hope that they start economists being active in these conversations. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks very much, Donna. We could have a long, rich discussion about this interesting work, but it's time to move on to the next presentation. Donna, I hope you can answer these questions as you have the time, either after the session or during the session. But we're going to move on to Ross Emmett, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the mastermind of this session. Ross is at Arizona State University, and he's going to present on Francis A. Walker and the Indigenous people of North America. Ross, I think you should be able to share your screen if you're giving slides. Are you there, Ross?
There we go.
Great.
And
I'll say we have 30 minutes or 20 minutes for the presentation, Ross.
yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. You can hear me? Can you see my slides?
I can hear you, but I cannot see your slides.
Okay, thought I might have that trouble. It's because I didn't share screen. That better?
I can see them.
Good, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so I apologize. I thought I was going to see more than I'm seeing, so I need to grab something for myself. There we go. In keeping with Donna's presentation, and actually this presentation builds directly on Donna's presentation in some ways, but I'll start by indicating that this session and this paper, I'm joining this session from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples that was seated appropriately in the specific treaty in which they ceded lands is the Treaty of Saginaw. Tim Leonard tells us that the progressive era founders of American economics neither wrote nor looked for the applause of their peers. Probably they did want the applause of their peers, but they intended to influence affairs. And Francis Amasa Walker is no exception to this. Walker, that didn't help me. My apologies. Walker's was the first president of the American Economic Association and was one of the best retailers of economics for the nation from 1870 until his death in 1897. He came to America's attention with the first statistical atlas of the United States, published in 1874. That's going to be a date that will stick, you can pin, and which captured the imagination of a nation yearning to see a bright future following the defeat of the Confederacy. Walker's statistical and economic vision was backed by his institution building at the US Census Office, in the Bureau and the Office of Indian Affairs, and eventually as the president of the American Statistical Association, the founding president of the American Economic Association. He's the only person to have held the presidency of the American Economic Association for more than a single year. And he was also the president of MIT at a crucial point in its history. All of that is background to this paper. Walker's book, The Indian Question, published in 1874, laid before the public the case for four things. First of all, not giving up on, and this is going to be a loaded term and still is, not giving up on civilizing indigenous peoples. He also made the case to reject President Grant's proposal to move all indigenous peoples onto a single, very large reservation, probably in the territory already recognized as Indian territory. Making the case to move indigenous peoples who were not ready to become American citizens onto reservations. So he opposed the president's plan for one, but he still actively promoted the creation of reservations, and employing the strategy of separation and seclusion to prepare indigenous peoples to become American citizens, and to ask the American public to protect them from corrupting influences. Of course, the result of Walker's work was not what Walker envisioned. Good intentions, even backed with statistical analysis, was not enough to prevent the military-led crowding of indigenous peoples onto existing reservations across the West. Walker's plans for reservations to be places of separation, seclusion, and education for participation in industrial life turned out to be insufficient. Reservations left indigenous peoples without land, without resources, without education, and without hope in a progressive nation, quote unquote, progressive. Walker had a long career after his work began during the Civil War, working for several generals. We're focused really on a single year, or if you will, 2 years of his life. In 1870, he became the bureau chief for the US Census, and after Congress had given it some troubles in an attempt maybe to prevent them from knowing how many people there were, but he took over and was running the census. But in the next year, in the 1871 congressional appropriations, they did not fund the census. So in anticipation of that funding being lost, the Secretary of the Interior asked Walker to take over the just recently empty chair of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and be paid by that position and do that work, plus also complete his work on the US Census. And that's what Walker did. And for a period of basically 12 months, from November 1871 to November 1872, Walker both completed the US Census enough to be able to report on it to Congress, and also worked as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. After he left Washington in 1872, he went to Yale, to the Sheffield School. After that, he completed a project that he had been working on in the census, which was the Statistical Atlas of the United States, that made a big splash and helped make his career as a statistician. But he also published in 1874 a book that contained 3 essays, which I'm going to talk about, called The Indian Question. As you know, and I've already mentioned his presidencies in the American Economic Association and MIT. So I'll just move on to the material that we want to focus on. Walker's Office of Indian Affairs report, he says, look, I'm just throwing together as much information as possible to give you an idea of where things are at with indigenous peoples. But he says, the question we're trying to answer is what shall be done with the Indian as an obstacle to the progress of settlement and industry? And that question is going to be, the question he's going to ask and look at and address in the book. In the book, The Indian Question, there's 3 essays, as I said. They were, the first 2 essays are very similar, but they have slightly different answers to the question of what shall be done or how it shall be done. And I've amalgamated the answer together in the rest of this presentation and the paper, but they do have slight differences and were intended for slightly different audiences. The third essay is a revised extract from the census report, which is the population figures that Walker creates, accounting for all of the at least trying to account for all of the indigenous peoples in within the territorial boundaries of the United States. And so Walker's question in the Indian question is, what is necessary to traverse the distance between savagery and civilization? And I discussed his use of the term savagery in the paper. I'm not going to say much about it here. But the key is that for Walker, one needs to be civilized to be capable of participating as a citizen in the United States. So civilization, the civilizing process, was going to happen on these reservations that he was talking about. And this was going to enable indigenous peoples to individually become members of the United States. I skipped over a little bit earlier, just in the sake of time. And if you had some questions from earlier, I can return to that later in the Q&A. But the key features of Walker's plan resided around the reservations. And here we have the elements that Walker argues for regarding reservations. First of all, they should be permanent. That is, they should be guided by a principle of separation and seclusion. On the reservations, and so I'll just touch on the second point as well, because it will help me with the first one. In the second point was that they would be consolidated, and that is that while he opposed President Grant's idea of a single reservation, he thought that probably two large reservations in different parts of the West would be able to contain all the groups that needed individual land, but within the same, under the same jurisdiction of the Office of Indian Affairs. And so the principle of separation and seclusion was that others were to be kept away from the reservations, and that indigenous peoples would be prevented from abandoning or leaving the reservations. And so these 2 points, the next two, obviously highlight that. There would be no intrusion, he uses that word, no intrusion of whites upon lands reserved to Indians. And that should be provided against by congressional legislation. And there should also be no abandonment of indigenous peoples from reservations. That is, what was required was more than a pass system which allowed people to leave and then come back. Instead, there should be arrest and return procedures put in place, fixed and prescribed by law, that would prevent indigenous peoples from abandoning the land, the reservation reserved for their people. And then fifthly, so the rest resides around sort of what's being done on the reservation. So it's an educational system. So reform education system. Rigid reformatory control should be exercised by the government over the lives and manners of the Indians, with the key being that they should learn and practice the art of industry, so that in the future they could become members of an industrial society, which is what he considered the United States to be. And he did, however, say that there should be provision by the government for the subsistence of the indigenous peoples through in their long and painful transition from a hunter life to an agricultural and then industrial life, and that compensation should be liberal and generous, given that it was that the United States was putting upon them this significant transition between what Walker would call savagery and the transition to civilization, and also argued that congressional funds could also be used to set up endowments if they were not entirely spent in the immediate term, should be set up as endowments to enable Indigenous people as they leave the reservations for working in the industrial world to have some start to their industrial life. I'm making these comments without trying to add my own comments on. So Walker's conclusion is that Indian citizenship is to be regarded as an end, not a means. That is, it's the goal to civilize Indigenous peoples to the point where they can be citizens of the United States. And the means then to that goal is the reservation and the course of industrial instruction and constraint maintained by the government with kindness, but also firmness under the shield of the reservation. In the paper, I talk about each of those things, so I summarized it here so we can talk more about specifics. This is one of the plates from Walker's Statistical Atlas of 1874. It's the constitutional population map. Notice that the shades of purple are density measures. This was the first map, Statistical Atlas, to provide the kind of population densities and the way in which that Walker did this. So it was quite innovative at the time, and we're used to this today. And the slightly orangey territories are large Indigenous reservations, the reservations for Indigenous peoples, and there's also some lighter smudgings, looks like almost, which are actually hunting grounds that had been allowed for them. You may be more familiar with this picture recently from which is the frontispiece for Walker's book, The Indian Question. Here you see in this bright orangey color the lands which have been reserved as reservations, and Walker's suggestion of consolidation. And I'll just add that it's not exactly, he doesn't have he doesn't detail a plan for what the two large reservations, but he does say if they are too large, they will be crossed. So he suggests a sort of more northern sort of territory and a southern territory. And of course, Indian Territory was already identified by President Grant as being what he thought the reservation land should be. And Walker might also add something in that upper grouping that is in the current states of Montana and the Dakotas. And with that, I will open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Ross. So what I'll do is wait for the Q&A to populate with some questions, and then we'll take some time where I'll read some of them. I guess I have one question about this very interesting topic. I'm curious if this two reservation system, the separation and seclusion proposal, did it have legs? Was it taken very seriously? And to what extent do you know who opposed it and supported it? Were there any kind of well-defined constituencies that wanted it or did not want it?
So far, I have focused simply on understanding Walker, which was a difficult enough task, so I don't have the answers to the questions of what came out of this. You can clearly see the connections to Donna's paper earlier in terms of how in how they sort of intersect at points. But I do not know the question of where it went from here. My impression is that it did not have much legs with the because of what was already beginning to happen was the massive migration, and he left. He was writing from outside government. He did indicate late in life that he wanted to return to this issue, but then he never did. So essentially, he moved on. His writings beyond this were often about immigration issues and labor issues. And there's some places where he touches upon this, but he doesn't go back to this in any systematic way.
Yeah, if there was any serious debate about it, it would be perhaps illuminating to know who the proponents and opponents were in terms of understanding the political economy of what actually did happen.
Right.
So I think Michael McCulley has the next question, and I'll read it to you. He said he may have missed this. Was he an actual government advisor on all of this, or was this more of a theoretical? Did he play more of a theoretical role in advancing these ideas?
So, Michael, I would say this is a theoretical writings based upon his government service for 1 year serving as bureau chief for Indian Affairs. So he was the commissioner of Indian Affairs for the United States for 1 year, and then subsequently wrote about that, addressing these questions. He is clearly addressing an audience which has an interest in the question. I simply haven't moved at this point beyond trying to sort of really make myself familiar with his talk. I could just add that obviously Walker is extremely optimistic, and what really happens is that all of his sort of vision for this gets swept aside, and what he is, how he is often portrayed is in this sense correct. He provides support for the creation and the continuation of reservations, and they become a place which are not the kinds of sites he optimistically hoped for. And ultimately he's and Richard, given your question, I haven't looked to kind of trace citations of his work yet. This is something I can do as a future part of this kind of research, and I'm interested to know that Hoxie wrote about it, and so I will definitely track that down, because I have other connections to interest in Hoxie.
I have a follow-up to Dick Todd's question, is one from Alejandro, and he's wondering, Dick's, I guess, question is more about Walker's influence on thinking and academic thought, but Alejandro's curious what his impact might have been on policy. And I was wondering that as well when I was looking at the table that had the 7 policy proposals. I mean, in some, at least in some form, you know, a number of those policies or those ideas seem to be embedded in policies that were enacted.
Yeah, but I don't know whether they come from Walker or whether it's a just, you know, simultaneously. I mean, it seems like if one's thinking in this vein, some of these things seem like logical issues. I did ask a friend of mine who is a philosopher of African thought. I asked him about the similarity to the apartheid system, because there's very clear, some aspects of it are very clear, homelands, the security of the homeland, but there they were viewed as labor camps, and you did have past systems. Here, the intention was very different, to isolate them, bring them to the level of civilization, and then allow them to go forward. And then Endicott asks about Walker and his later immigration policy. And Annie, I definitely agree with you that there is linkage between them. I think the key is the question about civilization. And when I presented this paper at Duke, I explored this a little bit more, and I've taken it out of the paper as it is, because it's long enough as it is. But I think it's something I want to explain more. I have a sense that Walker thinks of savagery and civilization as sort of two different states, not a continuum, whereas with his discussion, for example, of Southern Europeans, he sees them as civilized, but as incapable of participation in the American context. So I'd like to explore that more, and I'd really like your help, Annie, on that, in seeing how his discussion about indigenous peoples and his discussion about Southern Europeans, as he described it, can be connected. I gave that up. I had hoped to write about that, but I gave that up in the context of this paper.
Great. Well, I appreciate the great presentation, Ross. And
the paper is available. Oh, well, I can make the paper available at this point. I haven't put it on anywhere yet, but I'm happy to make the paper available to others if you can't access it from this session.
Great. Thank you, Ross. So next will be, I think, Miriam Jorgensen presenting a paper on the Economist and the Indigenous economics. Miriam is at the University of Arizona. It's a co-authored piece, and some of her co-authors are present. Dara Kelly from Simon Fraser University is here. Randy Akey from UCLA is also here. And I think I saw Valentina from the Virginia Military Institute is also here. So Miriam, you have the floor. And before you start, I wanted to ask if there's a paper associated with this presentation yet?
There is a very brief paper associated with this presentation, and it's like really drafty with a lot of wind blowing through it. But I'm happy to share that what I've got available for people.
I know all about. Often my presentations are associated with drafty presentations. Right, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I wanted to, you've already done what my first task was, which was to just acknowledge co-authors who are inspiring to the ideas of this paper. And I particularly want to recognize Dara Kelly, who sent me and several others an email about a year ago that raised some of the issues that we'll get to at the end of this presentation. And I may just tee up Dara to comment a little bit more on that when the time comes. And also just want to reach out and say thanks to Valentina, who also provided some of the RA support for this developing work. And just thank them for being online to give me backup here. I wanted to acknowledge territory. I'm speaking to you today from St. Louis, Missouri, where I live, despite working at the University of Arizona and Harvard University. And this is the traditional territory of the Wasatch or Osage people. And of course, it's land that was settled much before that. There's settlements here that go back at least to 10,000 years to the place called Cahokia, which was the site of settlement for Illini and other pre-Wasatch peoples. I also wanted to thank Ross for pulling this thing together. I particularly wanted to acknowledge not just the History of Economic Society, but also the Association for Economic Research of Indigenous Peoples, which you can find out about AERIPecon.org. So this panel is co-sponsored by ARIP, which is an emerging organization that represents research on Indigenous peoples. And Ross was kind enough, as a member of the society and who had a panel available through his presidency of the History of Economic Society, to offer this panel to us. So just a real shout out to Ross for the support of ARIP. And if you're listening to this panel and you're not yet a member, I really encourage you to check out the website and to join. Randy Aki, who is a co-author, is the current president of the organization, and Valentina Dimitrova-Grazal is the rising president. Dara is a board member, and Jonathan Taylor is our treasurer of the organization, and I'm a past president. So very excited to talk to you a little bit today about something that is quite modern history of how economics talks about Indigenous peoples. But I do want to point out that the technique we use to look at this modern history, we're looking kind of at the period of 1997 to 2021. So it's historical, but more modern history. The technique that we use in this and the data set that we're using is amenable to looking much further back in time. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the paper too. So I just wanted to start out with some information that some of you may be well aware of. That's one of several motivations for the particular spin we take on this data today. The Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession has produced a report that many of you may be familiar with. It came out in December of 2019, and it provides a whole history of the graduates from bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and PhD programs in economics divided by race and ethnicity. And just for comparison purposes, I've pulled the year 2016 because there was some easily available data, particularly on the enrolled undergraduate population from that time period, to give a sense of what really is a proportionality problem and essentially a pipeline problem within economics for Indigenous peoples. And you can see here that in 2016, there are about less than one third of 1% of all economics bachelor's degrees graduated that year were awarded to American Indians and Alaska Natives. Approximately the same percentage, less than 1/3 of 1% master's degrees, and no PhDs in that year. The report on the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession indicates that these numbers have varied over time, with some highs going up to as far as about 0.7%, 0.7 of 1% in the, around 2000 and again around 2010. But really, typically, the number of individuals who are of self-identified American Indian or Alaska Native is pretty low. And yet, we don't really know if it's low without some comparison. So I've provided some comparisons here in the data. And particularly the one I want to draw your attention to is not so much the American individuals as American Indian and Alaska Native individuals as a proportion of the US population. And that's in 2016, at least, those figures were around 2% of the US population. But instead to think about them as a proportion of the enrolled undergraduate population. And the Department of Education's National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study points out that about 0.8 of 1% of the enrolled undergraduate population in 2- and 4-year institutions self-identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native. So you would anticipate that if there were some even distribution of majors, you might have a greater proportion of American Indians graduating with BAs as well in economics. So there does seem to be at least somewhat of a pipeline problem. And that's just one of several motivations, because if you think about what shapes the impressions of economics as an area of study, one of them is the people that we see in the field. Are there other people who are of Indigenous race, ethnicity, tribal status, First Nation status in the field that you see that are visible as students, as as teaching assistants, as professors. But that kind of representation isn't the only kind of representation that's important. The other kind of representation that I think matters is the things that the field itself puts forth as important. And whether or not that's the things that the studies that are conducted, the way those studies are done, the information included in those studies, as papers earlier in this panel have discussed, or even the things that faculty members assign to undergraduates to read, and that are suggested as being important to think about with regard to economics. One of the things that it's not uncommon for individuals who teach economics at the undergraduate level to assign is a publication like The Economist for a variety of reasons, including that it typically engages issues that come up in undergraduate classrooms. It's quite accessible to read for many undergraduate students, and it has broad and engaging coverage that oftentimes is the sort of thing that manages to entertain as well as teach. As the mother of two undergraduate students right now, I can tell you they have both been assigned economics readings from The Economist magazine. So this is, while I don't have specific numbers on it, I can tell you it's not uncommon. And in fact, it was this kind of assignment that Professor Kelly gives in her business classrooms at Simon Fraser University that actually began to motivate this paper early on, which is what might a commonly assigned publication like Economist be leaving as an impression about economics for Indigenous peoples? What impressions are left about Indigenous economics, the engagement of Indigenous peoples in economics, and what are we kind of being implicitly taught from reading the magazine and its coverage of Indigenous peoples? But of course, I want to put that as, like I said, one motivation, and that we'll explore a little bit more today in this current time period, but it suggests an even more general motivation for the kind of work that I'm going to be presenting to you, which is, what is The Economist overall teaching any or all of its readers about Indigenous economics and Indigenous economies? So the method that we've employed is to search The Economist for articles that discuss Indigenous peoples and Indigenous people using both broad and nation-specific terms. You can see here a number of the terms that we're using, very much focusing initially on North America, using terms like American Indian, and Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Aboriginal, and then Maori, then some specific tribes like Lakota, Dakota, Navajo, Cherokee, etc. And the word that I didn't put on here, I see, is we've also included the word Indigenous, and that's been a word that's yielded a lot of information that's non-North American. There's actually a writing rule that The Economist uses that it will provide simple and short, small explanations of specialist words. So typically when we depart from the Kansas countries, or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and Indigenous populations are talked about, say, from Africa, Asia, South America, the Russian influenced area, former Soviet Union, the word Indigenous or Aboriginal would come up as an explanation of a term used that is a tribal or Indigenous people's name. So the use of the term Indigenous has been very useful to drawing out those international populations. In the Kansas or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United States setting, it is not uncommon for just a tribal name, especially these larger major people groups, to be mentioned alone without explanation, under the assumption that the Economist readership might know what they are. So those are some of the things we've learned about employing this search terminology. As I've mentioned, we've focused initially in this paper because we're kind of motivated by the idea of what people are reading in recent history that might, to some extent, be one of the many factors behind shaping the attraction of Indigenous people into the economics field. So we're looking at that period, 1997 to 2001, of 25 years of recent history. And we're using the search engines of the Economist digital edition itself, which has kind of a clunky search tool, but it also is yielding quite a bit of information, most of it which matches the Gale historical database, which indexes the Economist magazine. And here's the critical point for those of you interested in the broader search mechanism from its founding in 1843 onward. So this same technique could be used to go back deep into history. And in fact, when we began first thinking about this paper, just under a year ago, our goal was actually to do that full set of research. But as we got started, we had to, start someplace. So we began with the most recent 25 years. I will tell you that, and this is in the spirit of this being a drafty paper, here's how far we've gotten using the bright blue search terms. And again, I'm sorry, I forgot to add the word indigenous. That's also been searched. For 25 years of recent history, we've got incomplete information gathered for 25 of those years, but complete information for 1997, 2004, 2010, and 2017. One thing I should add also is that we're collecting initially articles that are focused squarely on Indigenous people. In other words, the article itself is about Indigenous people, Indigenous topics, and there isn't just a sort of throwaway or extra explanation information added about Indigenous people. So to give you an example of what I mean, and I'll come back to this later in the presentation, there was an article from 1997 that was discussing the proposal to put equality of gender representation in a voting system. And The Economist wrote an article about the particular polity that was considering this, and talked about how the individuals, the voters who were considering this reform to their government voted that down, saying that it wasn't necessary to have an equal representation of women and men. And they added on that they're just in a couple of sentences that in Nunavut, the Inuit people of Nunavut had done a similar thing. And so the article itself was about whether or not there ought to be gender representation in voting mechanisms, in representative bodies. But then it had this little bit that was added about Inuit people in Nunavut as well. So that article didn't count into our main focus, which was articles that are about Indigenous people and about Indigenous topics. I'll come back to that though, as we start to explore the information. But that is the search that we conducted, the terms we used, the universe that we're looking at. And I'm going to begin by presenting to you the data, the complete data we have for 97, 2004, 2010, and 2017. So first I wanted to mention what the universe kind of looks like for any individual year of data that we consider. There are about 3,300 indexed articles, reports, and letters per year. We include letters. It turns out to be important to do so because the Economist also has an editorial policy of making sure that it increases the diversity of opinion in the newspaper by including letters that challenge what show up in its articles. So it is actually a way that it's broadening the way it talks about things and discusses things via the letters. And indeed, we have found a couple of letters that are fairly substantive additions to the discussion of Indigenous issues. For instance, a letter that appeared in, I believe, 2004, which talked about the importance of returning to traditional cropping in Africa, in Latin America, and in South America, because Indigenous populations there, and they named some specific ones, had already refined historically ways to grow foods that had high carbohydrate, high nutritional value, and were better than some of the Western introduced crops in those regions. And the letter was basically pointing out the importance of Indigenous knowledge. So that shows that not just articles and reports, but some of the letters are important things to index and keep track of. So approximately 33 of those a year, 51 issues a year with about 65 articles per issue, a holiday quote unquote double issue, which doesn't actually double the number of articles. But given this number, this base, looking at the years that we've searched for articles and letters and reports specifically focused on Indigenous topics, you can see in that top line of table 2 that we're not finding a lot. There were 10 articles in 1997, 6 in 2004, 8 in 2010, and 12 in 2017. Now, admittedly, we haven't finished that search terms list that I mentioned to you, but because we're searching on terms like Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, Alaska Native, and some of those broader tribal names, we're picking up quite a few things. So as we're adding new search terms in, we're typically repeating articles that have already been found. And so we're only adding articles around the margin at this point. So while I can't put an exact number on it, my gut tells me that what you're seeing there is about 80% of the articles in any one of those years that are squarely focused on Indigenous peoples. You can see the subsets that there's a lot of concentration on the US and Canada and Australia, and then Indigenous peoples elsewhere is fewer. But I do think that on one level, the first impression is that's a surprisingly small number. But I think it's worth exploring whether or not this is really a little coverage or a lot of coverage. That number of articles, remember 52 or 51 issues per year, suggests that you're getting an Indigenous focus article about once every 6 weeks. One thing we were interested in, and you can see that in the second bullet point, is whether or not there might have been any change in the sort of pre-passage of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then post-passage of that. It happened in September of 2007. We don't really have enough data yet to know whether or not there was any real change. From the little bit of data that I've shown you so far, it doesn't look like there was a particular change, but it would be a moment at which a major news magazine might begin to talk differently about Indigenous people, particularly since the focus of that magazine is on political economics, and the UN Declaration had so much to do about the political and economic rights of Indigenous peoples. So I think that's one of the things that we're putting to the side that we'd like to continue to consider as our data set continues to be filled out. But we're able to do closer investigation a full year where we've gone in and aggressively pulled in those articles that are like the voting article I just talked about that said, look, there's relatively few articles that are squarely focused on Indigenous issues, but maybe that's not that bad. Maybe it's useful to look at those articles that have a more glancing mention of Indigenous people. Now, what we're still excluding, mind you, are any of those articles that are talking about Jeep Cherokees or a Mohawk haircut or a band that's named after an Indigenous tribal nation or word. So we're still getting rid of what are truly the throwaway mentions, but that might include a reference to Indigenous people in a substantive way. For instance, in noting that a particular Indigenous group in Ecuador is part of a political coalition, or that Indigenous lands in Honduras are being abused by being used for drug trafficking through for drug trading coming up from Colombia to the United States. So those kinds of mentions we include, and by looking at a single year 2017, we increased the number of articles from around 8 to 23 with 15 new additions in that area. And so that suggests that there's a mention about every 2 weeks of Indigenous topics in the course of a year, and about 0.70% of 0.7% of all articles in a year might mention Indigenous peoples. But still, it's hard to know if that's a lot. There's a degree of frequency that's developing there, but it's hard to know whether or not that's sort of raising the importance of Indigenous people. So we're fishing around a little bit to try to understand what a lot might be or a little might be. And one thing I've been considering lately is just, if we've got 195 countries in the world and 20 of them are considered G20 important countries, how much might one of those non-G20 countries be mentioned, the other 175 over the course of the year in Economist? So that starts to help us think a little bit about frequency of mention. But this to me is all top level stuff. And really Dara's students, and Dara, when she was kind of motivating the article, was interested not just in number, but also in content. So I've got a couple of things that help us think about content of these articles. And the first is one that was actually proposed by one of our undergraduate RAs. As she was reading the articles, she noted that it was important to think about who was speaking in these articles. Were Indigenous people being given voice in the articles? And so she began to code for us, and we've continued that coding across other RAs, is to understand whether or not there's a quote or a paraphrase from an Indigenous individual in the article. Is their voice being forwarded in this work? And so you can see, even though we've got relatively low numbers, it's actually encouraging, I think, to see how oftentimes there is direct quotation from Indigenous peoples, and that there's an authentic voice coming through in those pieces. It's not just non-Indigenous editors and writers speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples. The one thing that does jump out, and again, these are the data are very few, but it is interesting to see that within at least the USA subset, so that if you're an American Indian or Alaska Native student reading this, that is one of the areas in which Indigenous voice is the least. Although, of course, that's, like I said, a very small sample at this moment, and one of the reasons we're so excited to keep pushing and fill out that whole 25-year span of information. Just have a couple more slides to show you. This is where we're really getting to where the rubber hits the road and starting to sort articles based on their topic area of coverage. These are sort of 5 headlining areas of topics areas of coverage for The Economist. Of course, the magazine began as a purely magazine that was focused on liberal and neoliberal economics, but it has quickly migrated to being more of a political economic publication and focusing also on business and economics. But in the last 2 or 3 decades has significantly expanded its coverage of things like arts, culture, language, and religion, the environment and its linkages to politics and business, and of course, covering some issues around socioeconomic status. I'm sure that there are other ways we could code these, and this will be an ongoing conversation within our author group. But as a quick and dirty, you can see how the articles out of the 4 years considered, 1997, 2004, 2010, and 2017, break out across these categories. So one of the critical things, of course, is that we see that politics is the area that is most discussed with Indigenous peoples. So a walk-away point, if you're an American Indian or Alaska Native or other Indigenous person looking at The Economist, one thing you might conclude is that Indigenous economics and Indigenous economies are not particularly important to folks who write about economics in The Economist. So instead, we see there's only 7 purely focused on business and economics articles, and another 4 at the bottom of the screen on socioeconomic status. So I think that is interesting. And one of the first walkaways is maybe Indigenous economics aren't very important, is the lesson that you learn from reading this publication. I think you learn the very most about The Economist by looking closely at those articles that focus on business, economics, and socioeconomic status. And so I've taken those articles, of which there are about 11, and categorized them across, sort of the general things they say about Native people, the walk-away feeling that you might have about Indigenous economies. And they say these things: that Native people stand in the way of development, for instance, by preventing wind farms on Cape Cod and standing in the way of mining in the Philippines. That Native peoples are unable or lack the capacity to advance development. They're unable to develop their wind farms in North Dakota, despite having great ideas on that front. They're unable to advance housing construction on US Native lands. They've been unable to advance Native cropping in Africa and South America. Native peoples harm the environment in order to make profit, even when the laws that settler colonial states have made are trying to help them be better conservationists by doing things to control, dam, or sell Western water, and opting to develop parts of the Amazon that were set aside for carbon sequestration. That Native peoples tend to use sovereignty to take advantage of non-Indigenous customers and businesses, for instance, by creating tribally protected patents. And so even out of those few 11 articles, it seems clear that the main walkaway somebody might get is that Indigenous economics is an area that is a negative area, is a bad area. And here's where I think it circles back to Dara's students' protest, in a sense, a year ago, was that this is what The Economist its editorial and authorial language is communicating, but that's not the experience of Indigenous people at all. So if you're an Indigenous student reading this, you don't see yourself reflected in these pages accurately in any way, shape, or form. And at that point, I'm just wondering if, Dara, if you wanted to comment on that at all. I don't mean to call you out, but if you wanted to say anything about that.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much for presenting our paper. Yeah, and I should say that I am a qualitative researcher, also not trained in economics. I'm a business scholar, and so with regards to that particular assignment, I ended up actually not doing it because I found it very difficult for me to be able to use the Economist for graduate level. So I teach MBA students and I teach to classes that are 90% Indigenous from all across Canada. And so this particular group is, quite quick to find these gaps and to say, this doesn't represent my voice. This is not representative of the all the hard work that we do as nations. In particular, so many of them are chiefs of their nations. They're on their band councils, and the work that they do is just not reflected within the Economist as a learning source, and as a learning resource in particular. So comes back.
So, Dara.
Dara, I think we've lost your audio. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Nick.
You can hear me. Dara, I don't know if it was a general problem, but I lost your volume the last couple minutes. And I think a few others may have. So I hope everyone could hear you. This strikes me as a fascinating project with a ton of potential, especially as you go back in time to, you said 1834, and fill in those gaps. I think the descriptive component of this analysis is going to be important and fascinating. So thank you for that presentation. Maybe Miriam or Dara, if you want to try to answer one or two questions before we go to the final presentation. I think Dick Todd had one. I'm happy to read it to you, or if you want to read it and answer it, it's up to you.
Sure. I'll just jump in. And Dick says that a unique abstract definition of Indigenous is not easy to agree upon, and that the UN basically adopts our approach of listing groups. Yeah, and I totally agree. We've been struggling with that, and that was one of the sort of main barriers of moving forward initially in this work, is kind of what to search on. We had additionally included the word tribes and tribal, but of course in the modern era, in modern history, we're picking up a lot of the use of the word tribe and tribalism as indicative of political factions and not giving us the search information we need at all. But it was very helpful to really come across explanations of how the Economist deals with things that it needs to explain, which is when we hit upon the idea that the use of the term Indigenous or Aboriginal, it was going to pull out a lot of those terms or those specific Indigenous names that we might not otherwise find. Your point about British Commonwealth countries and colonies is absolutely true. That has been a large readership of the Economist, and so they tend to use those tribal names more without explanation because of that, the history of just where the magazine comes from. It was mostly a British publication until the mid-1970s.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the presentation. I'm looking forward to following your project as it progresses. So we have one final speaker today is Ron Trosper, has joined us. Ron, do you want to try to project anything on the screen, or are you just going to talk us through the presentation? Ron is at the University of Arizona, and he is talking about economists and American Indian private property.
So I mixed my times up. I'm very sorry to have joined late, and I do have a screen presentation, but I can't do it from my phone. All right.
Well, there's certainly no requirement that you do a screen presentation. So it looks like maybe you're in a car.
I am in a car parked using my car battery. So I do have my outline in front of me, and I can proceed just fine. And I did post my PDF to the site for this session.
Great. Well, what we'll do, if it's possible, you try to target 20-ish minutes, and then if there's time, we'll ask you a few questions.
Great. So my argument is that we have, first of all, we have to carefully define individual private property. And when we do that, we discover that Indians did not have private property rights in land by all the evidence that they have. We do have systems of relationships that included land, but the lands were very productive because the good relationships promote productive commons. The two different views that I'd like to contrast for economists analyzing Indians is the first one is the early social theorists, John Locke and so forth, agreed that American Indians did not have private property for different reasons. One was to justify occupying Indian land. Another was applying their idea that Indians had been hunters. Recent economists have argued otherwise. They ignore evidence or use it selectively in trying to explain the emergence of private property by its efficiency, to argue that Indian material wealth was based on private property and can be again, or to argue entrepreneurship has created a strong private sector based on market principles. So in my paper, I review briefly in my other presentation, the characteristics of private property. And most of us know those: the rights to exclude others, rights to sell land, rights to manage the land, and complete rights to all the income from the land. It's a major error if one assumes that the presence of one of these items means that they're all present. So for instance, the right to exclude may be present, but there may be no market in land, and there may be a requirement that income be shared. So to get to the point of my argument, I'm not going to go through a quick I guess I do need to briefly justify the notion that Indians did not have private property. And I would point out that the main case, the family hunting territory version of the Algonquins, they had head stewards that controlled access, and these stewards were selected by their communities. They had to comply with community standards for relationships with land. They had to share with those people that had rights to share the land with them. And it's incorrect to say that they had private property. And I'm exploring these ideas in a book of mine Indigenous Economics, which will be coming out from the University of Arizona Press in 2022. Now, John Locke, if we go to the origin of property in John Locke, he actually proposed an open access system for getting property, whether if you mix your labor with the land, then you can acquire property. And American Indians were assumed not to have property in that sense, not to be using it productively because they were hunters. And Locke, following Locke, then people developed the private property system. So this justified taking Indians' land, and also that they offered an assimilation. Locke offered an assimilationist option that if you become a Christian and fence your land and generally act like a settler, then you can have land. Otherwise, you can't. Another aspect of the theory of that the economists in the 18th century had was that private property was the result of us going through a set of stages, starting with hunting, going to pastoralism, going to agriculture, and then finally commerce with money and exchange of land. This idea totally misunderstands the characteristics of Indian economies prior to settlement. There was no pastoralism. People did not herd animals. There was agriculture, and there was horticulture. There was tending the land in place. And so people did have use rights to particular pieces of land, but they this should not be considered private property. So the contrast between the Indians' use of land and private property was a big theme. Jessica Catalino discovered this when she started looking into those theorists. So let me jump to the present so we have enough time to discuss. You probably are familiar with Demset's origin theory of private property. He has a paper in 1967 called Toward a Theory of Property Rights, in which he asserts that Indigenous peoples, especially the Algonquins, discovered property rights as a result of the fur trade. The increase in the price of beaver made it pay to create a system of private property is the theory. But as I pointed out, and as other people have pointed out, particularly anthropologists, that was not the system back then. And even now, that system has been carried forward, and the Cree of Canada have written they've codified their system. It's called the EU Land Territory System, and they spell out in great detail how the old system was, and it has nothing to do with private property rights in the sense that Demset presents. In my research, I've discovered that the Lake Babine people in British Columbia consciously adopted a family territory system in order to solve the problem of open access and fights among themselves on the land in interior British Columbia. So if you apply Demset's theory of what is more efficient in managing common property, the Lake Babine people, by adopting the potlatch system of the coast of Latin America, of North America, applied Demset's theory, but they didn't adopt a private property system. They adopted a system of relationships with land that allow them to manage the land very well. Another point that I'd make is the recent literature on promoting entrepreneurship and business in Indian communities have picked up on this practice of picking this or that individual characteristic of Indian territorial systems and claiming that that shows the whole proper system was private property. This has been done by Terry Anderson in his book, Get the Incentives Right, where he argues that if Indians adopted private property, they'll be prosperous just like they always were. And what I'm arguing is that prosperity was due to a good system of managed common property through relationships with each other and through racial relationships with the land. So Anderson is turning kind of turning Locke on his head, saying, well, no, Indians did have private property, which is, as I say, I think that Locke had it right in that case. Then we have the recent literature that some folks in this discussion have been participating in which they try to convince Indians that entrepreneurship is based upon private property, when actually there you have plenty of entrepreneurship if you have relationships to land and if you manage your economy through relationships. And the evidence from the past that we had a long distance trade and that we had money doesn't show that we had private property, because it's not the case that trade, money, and property necessarily have to be connected together. So I very briefly summarized my argument. I kind of lost track of the time. Dominic, how much time do I have?
You still have a good 10 minutes or so.
Okay, I went too fast by far. You're
not obligated to use it, but you have it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I suppose it's a use right.
No, I'm going to, that's correct. Well, I'm going to dismiss that and share my time with other people. I just want to say that if we're going to, we should not apply private property systems or assume that private property systems need to be part of indigenous systems. In the modern era, we probably have to make compromises with the property systems as defined by the colonial powers. But I don't think we should buy into those systems. I think we should use the relational systems that we used to have, because those systems are good at dealing with common property problems. In fact, I'd like to close by emphasizing that the John Locke idea of individualism, that everything, all the land is out there to be taken, actually ties into the problems that individualists have in managing common property. And we sure see that right now when the individualist societies, particularly the one here in the United States, simply can't deal with a common cruel problem, the public good problem of controlling an epidemic. We're helpless because the individualistic system has taken over, and that's really a big mistake. So let me stop and answer questions. Hello?
Yes, sorry, it took me a minute to get back on board. So thank you for the presentation. And we have a Q&A where people can write in their questions, and I can read them to you, or you can look at them yourself and answer them. I guess I'll read them to you, but I'll start with my own question, which maybe will take a minute to develop. I'm familiar with lots of concepts of property rights, I guess, and one is the bundle of sticks analogy, where property can be thought of as this metaphor of a bundle of sticks, and incomplete rights means you hold some of the bundle but not all. Eleanor Ostrom speaks of a continuum of rights to resources, where full complete rights on one part of the spectrum includes the right to use, the right to transfer, the right to exclude. And then Thomas Merrill, who's a property law scholar, has argued at least at one point that the right to exclude kind of dominates all other rights. If you don't have the right to exclude, then do you really have private property? So that's all kind of background, but I guess my question is, it seems like one could take an extreme position and say there was no private property, or there always was private property. But do you think it's more likely that there was a wide variation across different groups of people for different types of land, and that some groups had a right structure that looked like it was on one end of the continuum, and others had a right structure that looked like it was on the other end of the continuum? And I mean, and so I guess that's my question.
So I agree that emphasizing the right to exclude is key. And there is a legal scholar who, Penner, who makes that point. But the other components about how you become an owner and so forth varies. But I do agree, even within one indigenous society, there would be possibly a range of relationships with land, so that if somebody improved their land or they were taking care of a tree, they would continue to have exclusive rights to that, and it could be passed on to others, but they couldn't sell it. They could only pass it on with the consent of their community, because the community would watch what they were doing. And so you could have long-term holding of land in the agricultural part of the economy, but in the part of the economy that's a common pool situation, such as with fisheries or with hunting, it's proper to manage to solve the prisoner's dilemma of open access. You need to have incentives that make people cooperate. And if you make folks share what they get from the common land, they can restrict their harvest on that common land and manage it better. And that's very much the case with the salmon people on the Northwest coast, where through the potlatch system, they enforced rights to share. And this argument that the only system of complete rights, that only one kind of bundle is the right bundle, I think is wrong. You can still look at it as a bundle, but if some of the one part of the bundle is you must share your harvest of fish with your neighbor, that provides a complete right, but it's not a private property right, because that's not how private property systems work. In a quick sketch, my answer.
Thank you for that. And there's other questions now in the queue, but I did want to follow up on the potlatch, because that's interesting to me. I mean, I think of, like, the Pacific Northwest indigenous groups harvesting salmon from weirs that were clan controlled, that you might even say owned or family owned, so that the actual, the spatial location of the catch was a pretty well defined property right, I would say. But then the sharing of that resource was enforced by this norm of the potlatch, which seems pretty different than, like, modern European style fisheries, where you'll have no right of a territory to harvest. It's done in the open water through competition, but then private rights to the harvest once it's caught. So it almost seems like the inverse system. And I don't know what you call closer to private property. It seems a bit like semantics to me.
Well, it's not semantics. And if we go back to Ostrom, she has a book on analyzing institutional diversity, and she argues that in a system, if you change one part of it, you might change the total system, so that it's not, you have to be careful what the constellation of the bundle of rights is, because changing some part may change the whole system. And I'm saying, if you change the rules for sharing the income, then you change the incentives. You encourage fishermen not to overfish, but you should not call that a private property system. And I think the individual quota folks have a great problem, because they farm out the analysis of what's the fishery is like to an outside group who doesn't understand it, when the fishermen can't understand it. So that's a whole nother argument. But my point is, and I'm following Ostrom on this, that pay attention to the entire system, because some part of it, if you change it, you change the way it works.
Thank you. I'm going to read to you a question from Dick Todd. He says, a typical pedagoggical simplification is to say that indigenous North American societies did not hold land as private property in the Blackstone sense, but that non-land property was more or less held privately, like horses, tools, and clothing. Do you disagree with that characterization of the non-land property?
I agree that certain on-land property was regarded as individual property. And the characteristic was those pieces of property could be characterized as things that were not conscious. But I will disagree on the horses issue and some of the other issues, is that if people had relationships with horses and they communicated with the horses and they passed them on, I agree, but their relationship with horses was more one of respect, of understanding the way the horses lived and the way they should live. So if it's a thing that you can, and the thing that is most clearly not something that is conscious is a song or a prayer. And so people could create a song and then own it and not be able to sell it. They could lend it to other people, but it was always recognized as theirs. But that's clearly a thing. But if it's not clearly a thing, then you have to examine what the specific rules are that govern the relationship between the people and the entity. And horses in particular are conscious beings that folks can communicate with, folks can have relationships with. That relationship should be respected. People's relationships need respect, but to classify that as treating the horse as a thing is incorrect.
I'll just say Dick said regarding land, he thinks you're on a good track and he looks forward to your book, as do I. I look forward to your book. When is it coming out?
Well, we're going to get the page proofs at the end in February and make the index, and I think it'll come out in August or September this year.
Great. So does anyone else have questions? The queue is open. I guess I'll fill it. I'll ask a question. So you talked about Dempsey's example as being a faulty account of what happened with beaver, and so like if we move away from the whether the facts are correct or incorrect, and so the facts of that case are incorrect, do you also challenge the sort of theoretical idea that there's some tendency for resource control to move towards private property as the resource becomes more scarce, which I think was part of Dempsey's argument, or it becomes, more economically valuable, I think separate from scarcity. So, like when the ability that a party has to enforce a private property increases, I think Dempsey says you're going to get movement towards private property. And when the scarcity of the resource grows and it becomes more valuable, you're going to get a movement towards private property. Do you dispute that as kind of a theoretical, like a valid theoretical claim?
Yes, I do. I think that if some things, if something like especially fisheries can't be managed in an efficient manner, and especially if the fish are scarce, you need to cooperate and let the fishery grow and restrict harvests. And the private property system doesn't allow you to do that because people can't coordinate. They're trapped in the prisoner's dilemma. And so even as a theoretical proposition, I don't think it works. It definitely doesn't work. Another aspect of it is the failure to identify distribution of income and sharing and relationships among people. So, and I would go back to saying that Dempsey's on his theory of the origin of property is wrong historically. It's feudal systems like in Japan and England that turn into private property when the landlords decide that they want a bigger share of the land, a bigger share of the property. And so the private property helps them do that. And it actually, I do agree that with the coming of capitalism, the private property helped and incentives and so forth. But I don't think it was because they were solving an open access problem.
Thanks for that. I have Dick Todd back on the queue, and he's got a follow-up on the issue of horses. I'll read it to you. He asked, does the book deal with horses and similar relational entities within a framework of property or control or something else?
So I don't address horses in my book. So that one is a little bit separate. But so what could you restate the question, Dominic? I think I missed part of it.
I'll read it. He says, does the book deal with horses and similar relational entities within a framework of property or control or whatever?
So I deal with
in properties in quotes.
Good. Well, it should be in quotes. No, I say that I deal with these issues as relationality. What is the system of relationships among the entities that are interacting? And so we would talk about relationships and creating relationships, not owning things. But a relationship is something that's definite and clear and has obligations. Very often we point out that relationships create responsibilities as well as rights. And I think the emphasis on responsibilities is what has to be brought up.
Great. Well, thank you for finding a way to make it to the program and to present from your car. It seemed like it went well from my perspective.
Well, I'm very sorry that I missed the other two presentations. I have a terrible problem with time zones, and sometimes I forget which direction the time goes. So I'm glad I figured it out while you were still going on, and I apologize. I'm sorry I missed the other two presentations. I did catch the end of Miriam's, which was very interesting. Where will this be available as a recording?
I can find that out. I think on the AEA website. In fact, there were 3 other presentations, all of which I think would be of interest to you. So I can coordinate with Ross Emmett, who's the real organizer of this session, and find out if the recording will be available or not. But I'm getting messages that saying we're running out of time. The session is supposed to end at noon Eastern time, and so we just have about 90 seconds left. So I want to take that time to thank everybody for the very interesting work that you're engaged in. I look forward to checking in on it as it progresses. And I'll give Ross an opportunity to say something, a final word if he wants, since he's at the bottom of this.
Well, I'll just indicate my happiness with many of the sort of cross connections in this paper. That went quite well, and thanks to the participants and to those who attended the session. I think the papers were and discussions were quite good, and I appreciate the feedback I received too. So thank you. And I want to make sure we recognize ARIP participation in this session and helping to organize it through their network, and I really appreciate their contribution as well.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.